Sometimes the people everyone wants gone are standing closest to the truth. The wind coming off the Oregon marina carried the kind of cold that settled deep inside old bones. It rolled through the harbor after sunset, sharp and wet, carrying the smell of salt water, diesel fuel, and rain waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Fishing boats rocked gently against weathered docks while gulls cried overhead before disappearing into the darkening sky. Most people hurried home before temperatures dropped further. Storefronts near Harbor Street glowed warm against the gray evening, windows fogged from coffee and soup inside. But near an abandoned seafood warehouse at the far edge of the marina, one man stayed where nobody wanted him. Daniel Walker pulled his old military jacket tighter against the cold as he sat quietly beneath the narrow overhang beside the boarded building. 58 years old, shoulders worn by time, and too many things he never spoke about. Daniel had learned long ago how to take up as little space as possible. People tolerated homeless men easier when they stayed invisible. Beside him rested Rex, a giant dark sable German shepherd whose thick coat barely moved against the cold wind. The dog sat alert, ears high, amber eyes quietly watching everything. Daniel reached into his worn backpack and pulled out half of an old sandwich wrapped carefully in paper. "Not much tonight," he said softly, tearing part for Rex. "But we still eat." Rex took the food gently. Always gently. Daniel smiled faintly. "Better manners than most people I know." Somewhere behind them, footsteps echoed against wet pavement. Daniel already knew what came next. Voices. Irritation. Complaints. It had been happening all week. There he is again. Daniel lowered his eyes slightly. A younger dock worker stood nearby, shaking his head while speaking into his phone. "Yes, same guy. Right by the old warehouse." He glanced toward Daniel. "People are getting uncomfortable." Daniel said nothing. He rarely did anymore. Fighting strangers never changed much. Across the parking lot, headlights swept slowly over the marina entrance as a dark pickup truck rolled closer. Daniel recognized it immediately. Victor Hale, property manager. Always clean coat. Always expensive boots. Always irritated. Victor stepped out, already frustrated before speaking. "I thought I made myself clear," he said sharply while approaching. Daniel slowly stood, stiff from cold concrete. "Just resting," he answered quietly. Victor looked toward the old sleeping bag, backpack, and metal water bottle near the wall. "This is private property." Daniel nodded once. "I know." Victor folded his arms. "Then why are you still here?" Daniel glanced briefly toward the harbor lights before answering. "Because there is nowhere else within walking distance that allows dogs." Victor exhaled hard through his nose. "That is not my problem." Nearby, Rex remained perfectly still, calm, watching. Daniel reached down, resting one tired hand against the shepherd's shoulder. "We leave early every morning," he said quietly. "We do not bother anybody." Victor laughed once without warmth. "People are complaining." Daniel looked confused. "About what?" Victor gestured impatiently. "About you being here." Silence settled for a moment. Cold wind moved between them. Somewhere nearby, ropes knocked softly against dock poles. Daniel had heard worse things before. Stranger things. Crueler things. Yet somehow the sentence still landed heavy. "About you being here." Like existing itself had become inconvenient. "Understood," Daniel said softly. "We will move." But before he could bend to grab his bag, something changed. Rex stood abruptly. Not startled. Not aggressive. Different. His ears rose sharply. Muscles tightened beneath dark fur. The shepherd turned slowly toward the abandoned warehouse behind them. Completely still. Daniel frowned immediately. "Rex." The dog did not move. Did not blink. Amber eyes fixed hard on the building. Then, slowly, Rex stepped forward. One step. Then another. Nose lifting into the air. Smelling something. Daniel's expression shifted. "Hey," he said quietly. "What is it?" Victor sighed loudly. "Great. Now the dog is acting up." But Rex ignored both men entirely. He moved closer to the boarded warehouse door, nose working carefully against the cold air. Then stopped. Completely still. Daniel had seen that posture before. Years ago. Different places. Different circumstances. Back when instincts mattered. Rex lowered his head toward the cracked concrete near the side entrance. Sniffed again. Harder this time. Then looked back toward Daniel with unusual focus. Not fear. Not excitement. Certainty. Daniel's chest tightened slightly. "No," he murmured quietly. You smell something? Rex let out one low sound deep in his chest. Not barking. Almost a warning. Victor stepped backward slightly. Control your dog. Daniel barely heard him now. Something about Rex felt wrong. Or maybe too right. The shepherd rarely reacted without reason. Especially not like this. Daniel stepped closer to the warehouse, slowly. Buddy, he said softly, what are you trying to tell me? Rex moved toward a section of cracked foundation near the corner of the building. Old concrete. Rust stains. Forgotten place. Then suddenly stopped again and stood completely still, staring hard at the ground as though waiting for Daniel to notice something nobody else could see. Wind pushed colder now across the marina while clouds swallowed the last light of evening. Somewhere far out on the water, thunder rolled softly beyond the horizon. Victor shook his head. You need to leave. Tonight. Daniel barely looked at him. Because Rex had not moved. Not even once. And after years together, Daniel had learned something important. When Rex refused to walk away from something, there was always a reason. The wind grew colder as darkness settled across the Oregon marina, carrying the sharp smell of salt and distant rain through rows of aging fishing boats. Harbor lights reflected softly against black water while most of the businesses near the docks shut down for the night. Warm laughter drifted from restaurants farther inland, but near the abandoned seafood warehouse at the edge of the marina, the air felt different somehow. Still, waiting, Daniel Walker stood quietly beside Rex, eyes narrowed toward the cracked concrete near the side of the building. The giant German shepherd had not moved in nearly 3 minutes. Not once. Not even when the cold deepened. Not even when Victor Hale stood nearby, growing more impatient by the second. Rex simply stared at the ground with complete certainty. Nose low, ears high, focus absolute. Daniel knew that posture. He had trusted it before. Years ago, places he rarely allowed himself to remember now. Buddy, Daniel said quietly, crouching beside the shepherd, what are you smelling? Rex lowered his nose again and sniffed hard against the concrete seam, then pawed lightly at the ground once. Deliberate. Controlled. Daniel frowned. Not random behavior. Intentional. Victor shoved his hands deeper into his expensive coat pockets and sighed loudly. You seriously planning to spend the night talking to your dog? Daniel stood slowly. He does not react like this without reason. Victor laughed softly without humor. It is an abandoned warehouse. He gestured toward the rusted building. Probably rats. Daniel looked toward Rex again. No, his voice stayed calm. Certain. Not rats. Rex suddenly pulled forward another few feet, nose moving carefully along the base of the wall before stopping again near an old drainage vent half hidden behind weeds. The dog sniffed once, twice, then sat down directly beside it, watching Daniel. Waiting. Something tightened quietly in Daniel's chest. Rex had been restless all week, though Daniel had blamed weather changes at first. Trouble always felt easier to ignore when life already carried enough of it. But now something felt different. Intentional. Like the shepherd had been searching for this exact spot. Come on, Victor snapped. Enough already. Daniel straightened slowly. We are leaving. But even as he reached for Rex's collar, the shepherd refused to move. Not aggressively. Just firmly planted. Still staring at the vent. Daniel tried again. Rex. Nothing. Another soft pull. Still nothing. The German shepherd only looked up briefly before turning back toward the wall. Daniel exhaled quietly through his nose. That unsettled him more than anything. Rex obeyed. Always. Unless something mattered. Victor shook his head in irritation. This is exactly why people complain. Daniel said nothing. Some arguments no longer felt worth spending energy on. Yet something about the situation stayed with him as he slowly packed their small camp beneath the warehouse overhang. Old sleeping bag. Backpack. Water bottle. 2 cans of dog food. Life reduced into things easy enough to carry. Nearby, Rex kept glancing back toward the building, even while Daniel clipped on the leash. Even while they walked slowly toward the harbor parking lot. Halfway across the marina, the dog stopped again, turned around, refused to keep moving. Daniel looked back toward the warehouse, sitting alone against dark water and rusted fencing. Wind swept hard across the harbor now. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again. Quiet but steady. You really do not want to leave it alone, huh? Daniel murmured softly. Rex stood perfectly still, watching. Daniel sighed quietly. All right, he finally said. We come back tomorrow. Only then did the shepherd relax enough to keep walking. Later that night, Daniel found temporary shelter beneath an old fishing awning near Harbor Point where wind barely reached them. The place smelled faintly of rope and salt water, but it stayed dry enough. Rex curled close beside him while cold air moved softly through the marina. Daniel pulled his old jacket tighter and stared quietly toward dark water. Sleep rarely came easy anymore. Too many memories tended to wake before dawn. Yet tonight felt stranger than usual. Because Rex had never acted like this. Never. The shepherd trusted instincts Daniel had learned long ago not to ignore. Somewhere after midnight, Daniel woke suddenly. Rex was standing, alert again, ears raised, staring toward the distant warehouse visible between harbor lights. Quiet, focused, waiting. Daniel slowly sat upright. Still thinking about it, he whispered. Rex looked back once, then returned his attention toward the dark building. Like something unfinished waited there. Daniel rested tired elbows against his knees. Tomorrow, he said softly. We look tomorrow. If you are enjoying this story so far, please remember to like and subscribe so you do not miss more heartfelt stories like this one. Wind moved softly across the marina while somewhere far away thunder drifted over black water again. And though Daniel did not yet understand why, one feeling stayed with him long after sleep finally returned. Rex had not found something by accident. The dog had been trying to tell him something all along. Morning arrived gray and cold over the Oregon coast. The kind of morning where clouds hung low enough to swallow the tops of harbor cranes and fishing boats disappeared slowly into mist. Salt air drifted through the marina while gulls circled overhead, sharp cries cutting through the quiet. Daniel Walker stood near Harbor Point rubbing warmth back into tired hands around a paper cup of coffee someone from the bait shop had quietly handed him before sunrise. He had learned something over the years. Kindness rarely arrived loudly. Sometimes it came in silence. A free cup of coffee. Someone pretending not to notice your situation. A stranger saying good morning like you still belonged somewhere. Rex sat beside him, unusually alert again. Not restless. Focused. Watching the direction of the abandoned warehouse across the harbor road like he had unfinished business waiting there. Daniel looked down. You did not sleep much either, huh? Rex briefly glanced toward him before returning his attention to the distance. Daniel sighed softly. Guess we are doing this. The marina slowly woke around them. Engines rumbled alive. Men unloaded crates. Seagulls fought loudly over scraps near the docks. Life moved forward the way it always did. Busy, uninterested. Yet Daniel could not shake the feeling from last night. Rex had trusted instincts Daniel himself had once trusted in darker places, years ago, when missing something important could cost far more than pride. The old warehouse sat quiet when they returned after sunrise. Weathered boards covered broken windows. Rust climbed the old metal siding. A faded sign barely visible near the loading dock still read Harbor Pacific Seafood, though nobody had worked there in years. Wind pushed lightly against loose chain fencing nearby. Daniel stopped near the same cracked foundation Rex had stared at all night. All right, he said quietly. Show me. Rex moved immediately. Nose low. Purposeful. No hesitation. The German shepherd walked directly toward the drainage vent near the side wall and began sniffing again with complete focus. Then farther along the cracked concrete. Then back again. Patterned. Intentional. Daniel crouched slowly, knees stiff from age and sleeping rough. The concrete looked ordinary at first. Old stains, broken edges, rust. But then something caught his attention. One section near the wall looked different. Slightly uneven. Almost repaired. Like somebody had poured fresh material years ago without matching the original foundation. Daniel touched the surface carefully. Colder than the rest. Different texture. Rex immediately moved closer, standing beside him. Then pawed once against the edge. Not scratching wildly. Deliberate. Daniel narrowed his eyes. You are sure about this? The dog sat directly beside the spot again. Waiting. A truck door slammed somewhere behind them. I knew it. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Victor Hale approached from across the lot, irritation already written across his face. You really came back. Daniel stood slowly. We are not bothering anybody. Victor pointed sharply toward the road. You were told to leave. Daniel stayed calm. We are leaving. He hesitated briefly. Just checking something. Victor looked toward Rex, sitting near the foundation. Your dog obsessed with dirt now? Daniel ignored the sarcasm. There is something strange here. Victor laughed under his breath. You hear yourself? He stepped closer. This building has been empty for years. Daniel glanced toward the repaired section again. Maybe. Victor folded his arms tightly. People already think you are trespassing. Daniel lowered his voice. I am not looking for trouble. Victor shook his head. Then stop giving people reasons to complain. The sentence settled heavier than Daniel wanted to admit. Because maybe Victor was right. Small towns noticed people like him. Homeless veteran. Old coat. Dog too large for comfort. Easy to judge. Easy to blame. Daniel reached for Rex's leash. Come on, buddy. But Rex refused again. Completely still. Eyes fixed on the uneven concrete. Then something happened Daniel had not seen in years. The shepherd lowered himself near the ground and pressed his nose hard against a thin crack running along the edge of the foundation. One slow inhale. Then another. Suddenly Rex pulled back and let out one deep sound low in his chest. Not fear. Not warning. Recognition. Daniel froze. That sound. He remembered it. Different country. Different decade. Same dog instinct. Military dogs made that sound when they identified something specific. Something hidden. Something important. Daniel slowly crouched again despite Victor's frustration growing louder behind him. His fingers brushed carefully across the crack. Dirt shifted slightly beneath old concrete dust. Then he stopped moving altogether. Because something metallic sat barely visible beneath the narrow opening. Small. Rusted. Hidden deep enough nobody would notice without looking closely. Daniel stared silently for a long moment while cold wind rolled in from the water again. Rex remained completely still beside him. Watching. Waiting. Like he had finally brought Daniel exactly where he was supposed to be. Cold wind rolled harder through the marina as gray morning slowly deepened into afternoon. Clouds hanging low over the Oregon coast like they had nowhere better to be. Fishing crews moved in the distance, engines humming steadily against restless water while gulls drifted overhead looking for scraps near the docks. Yet near the abandoned seafood warehouse, time seemed strangely slower. Daniel Walker remained crouched beside the uneven concrete foundation, weathered fingers brushing lightly against the narrow crack where something metallic caught the light beneath years of dust and rust. Beside him, Rex stood perfectly still, alert, watching. The giant German shepherd had not lost focus for even a moment. Like somehow this place mattered in ways neither of them fully understood yet. Behind them, Victor Hale folded his arms tighter against the cold. You planning to stare at the sidewalk all day? Daniel barely looked up. His eyes remained fixed near the metal edge buried beneath broken concrete. There is something down there. Victor sighed sharply. It is an old warehouse. He gestured impatiently. You know what old places have? Daniel said nothing. Victor answered his own question. Broken junk. But Daniel was no longer listening. Something about the object unsettled him quietly. Not fear exactly. Familiarity. Like memory knocking gently from far away. He carefully rubbed dirt aside with the edge of his glove. More metal emerged beneath the crack. Rusted. Thick. Deliberate. Not trash. Not random debris. It looked manufactured. Heavy duty. Military almost. Daniel paused. His breathing slowed. Rex lowered his head near the spot again and sniffed once more before sitting directly beside Daniel. Body calm but focused. Waiting. Buddy, Daniel whispered quietly, what did you find? Victor stepped closer now, impatience turning into curiosity despite himself. Seriously, he muttered. What are you even looking at? Daniel finally stood slowly, knees stiff from crouching too long. Looks buried. Victor frowned. Buried what? Daniel glanced toward the building. Then the concrete again. Not sure. For several seconds nobody spoke. Wind rattled loose metal somewhere near the loading dock. Harbor water slapped softly against pilings nearby. The old warehouse creaked quietly in the cold, like something forgotten, settling deeper into silence. Then Victor rubbed one hand across his jaw. Listen, he said carefully now. Frustration softened slightly. I cannot have people thinking somebody is digging around private property. Daniel nodded once. Fair enough. He paused. I just want to know what Rex keeps smelling. Victor looked toward the shepherd. Rex stared back without blinking. Calm. Watchful. Almost unervingly intelligent. Your dog really thinks something matters here, huh? Daniel looked down at Rex briefly. He does not usually get things wrong. Victor hesitated, then glanced around the empty marina lot. You got anything to pry it open? Daniel almost laughed quietly at that. Not exactly carrying tools these days. Victor shook his head once like he already regretted the conversation. Yet after a moment, he muttered something under his breath and walked toward his truck parked nearby. Daniel watched him go, confused. 5 minutes later, Victor returned, holding a rusted tire iron from the back of his pickup. "This stays simple," he said quickly. 5 minutes. Daniel looked surprised. "Thought you wanted us gone." Victor shrugged awkwardly. "Still do." Then he glanced toward Rex. "But now I kind of want to know what your giant detective found." Daniel said nothing for a second, then quietly accepted the tool. Together they returned to the cracked foundation. Daniel crouched carefully, easing the tire iron into the narrow opening where rusted metal showed beneath the concrete seam. At first nothing moved. Years of weather held everything tight. Rex shifted closer. Watching intensely, Daniel adjusted the angle and pushed again. Slow pressure. 1 inch. Then suddenly something scraped beneath the surface with a low metallic sound. Both men froze. Daniel stopped breathing for half a second. Victor leaned forward slightly. "You hear that?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah." Carefully now, Daniel worked loose several chunks of brittle concrete near the edge. More metal emerged beneath dirt and debris. Rectangular. Heavy. Definitely not random junk. It looked like part of a compartment door buried below the foundation itself. Rex stood abruptly, ears forward. One low sound deep in his chest again. Recognition. Daniel felt it immediately. That old instinct from another life. Something important sat below them. Something hidden. Something meant not to be found. Victor crouched lower now, disbelief replacing irritation. What in the world? Daniel carefully brushed away more dirt until faded lettering barely surfaced beneath rust and age. Hard to read. Almost gone. But still there. He leaned closer. Wind moved softly around them while the harbor seemed to disappear for one strange, quiet moment. Then Daniel whispered the words slowly, barely believing them himself. United States Navy. Silence followed immediately. Even Victor stopped talking. Rex stood beside Daniel, eyes fixed on the buried compartment as though he had known exactly where to lead him from the beginning. The cold seemed sharper after the words settled into the air. United States Navy. Daniel Walker stayed crouched beside the buried compartment for several long seconds, weathered fingers still resting lightly against rusted metal while wind drifted across the marina carrying salt and the distant sound of boat engines returning to harbor. Beside him, Rex stood perfectly still, amber eyes fixed on the hidden compartment as though he had finally completed something he had been trying to say all along. Victor Hale stared down at the faded lettering, confusion replacing irritation for the first time since meeting Daniel. "That cannot be real," he muttered quietly. Daniel barely heard him. Something old had shifted inside him now. Familiar. Heavy. The feeling reminded him of opening forgotten mission files years ago. Quiet tension. Instinct. The sense that answers rarely arrived alone. Daniel carefully rubbed more dirt away from the metal edge. Rust crumbled softly beneath his glove. More lettering appeared, faded by time, but still visible beneath years of neglect. Numbers. Identification markings. Government-style formatting. His chest tightened slightly. Rex moved closer and lowered his head near Daniel's shoulder, breathing calmly. Daniel reached up without thinking and rested one hand gently against the shepherd's neck. "Good work," he said softly. "Really good work." Victor crouched lower, now despite himself. "You seriously think this belongs to the Navy?" Daniel nodded once. "Looks official." Victor frowned. Why would military property be buried under an abandoned fish warehouse? Daniel gave the smallest shake of his head. "I do not know." But privately, quietly, his thoughts had already begun moving elsewhere. Because strange storage locations did not surprise him. Not after military service. Especially not after operations nobody talked much about afterward. Forgotten places had a way of holding forgotten things. Rex suddenly shifted again, nose moving toward another section of cracked concrete farther along the wall. Then back again toward the compartment. Like there was more. Daniel noticed immediately. "You still smell something?" The shepherd sat again beside the compartment door, calm but intensely focused. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he murmured quietly. "I think you do." Victor stood abruptly and rubbed both hands against the cold. "Listen," he said carefully. "If this really belongs to the government, maybe we should stop touching it." Daniel nodded slowly. Probably smart. Yet neither man moved. Curiosity had already settled too deep. Wind rattled loose metal somewhere high on the warehouse roof. Nearby waves struck pilings in slow rhythm beneath gray afternoon sky. Then Daniel leaned slightly closer to the compartment again. Something caught his eye beneath dirt near the lower edge. He brushed more debris aside carefully. Rust flaked loose. A small metal plate surfaced beneath the grime. Bent, tarnished, but readable. Daniel froze completely. Victor noticed immediately. What? Daniel did not answer at first. His tired blue eyes narrowed carefully as memory rose somewhere deep and unwelcome. Old operations. Old names. Things buried for reasons nobody explained. Finally, quietly, Daniel read the plate aloud. Naval Recovery Unit. Silence followed. Victor looked confused. What does that mean? Daniel sat back slowly against the cold concrete. His expression had changed now. More distant somehow. Means somebody wanted something hidden, he answered softly. Victor frowned harder. Military equipment? Daniel hesitated. Maybe. Then after a pause. Or records. Wind moved softly between them while the marina carried on in the distance. Unaware something strange had surfaced beside a forgotten building no one cared about anymore. Rex shifted again, ears lifting suddenly toward the warehouse itself. Daniel noticed immediately. What is it? The shepherd stood and turned toward the boarded loading entrance several feet away. Nose raised. Smelling. Focused again. Daniel slowly stood beside him. You think there is more? Rex looked back once before moving several careful steps toward the warehouse wall. Then stopped. Daniel glanced toward Victor. He is not done. Victor exhaled slowly through his nose like he no longer knew whether to be annoyed or unsettled. I cannot believe I am saying this, he muttered. But your dog is starting to freak me out. Daniel almost smiled. Almost. He usually has a reason. They moved slowly toward the warehouse, entranced together. Old boards covered broken windows. Rusted chains hung loose near the loading bay. Everything smelled like salt, wet wood, and years of abandonment. Rex paused near the entrance and sniffed carefully beneath a section of damaged concrete, then stood completely still again. Daniel looked down. Something faint scratched across memory now. Not the warehouse. Not the smell. A name. A mission. Something unfinished buried somewhere in years he stopped talking about long ago. Then suddenly, quietly, Daniel whispered words he had not said aloud in nearly 20 years. No way. Victor turned immediately. What? Daniel looked toward the hidden Navy compartment behind them, then toward the warehouse. His face had gone pale beneath cold coastal light. I think I know what this might be connected to. Rex remained still beside the old loading entrance, watching Daniel carefully like he had already been waiting for him to remember. The sky darkened early over the marina, heavy clouds turning afternoon into something closer to evening, while cold mist rolled slowly across the harbor. Fishing crews headed home one by one, their engines fading into distance until only the sound of restless water and distant gulls remained. Near the abandoned seafood warehouse, Daniel Walker stood frozen for a moment beside Rex, thoughts moving somewhere far beyond the docks. I think I know what this might be connected to. The words stayed heavy inside him, because memory had finally caught up. Quietly, uninvited. 22 years earlier, Daniel had worked alongside a small naval recovery team attached to operations nobody discussed afterward. Most assignments involved recovery of equipment after coastal incidents. Missing cargo, lost records, things quietly removed from official conversation. One mission had ended strangely, abruptly. Paperwork disappeared. Questions discouraged. A teammate named Caleb Mercer had spent weeks asking why several recovery manifests no longer matched inventory. Then suddenly Caleb left the unit. No explanation. No goodbye. Just gone. Daniel had never fully understood it. Until now, standing beside an abandoned warehouse with a Navy compartment buried beneath concrete. Wind drifted softly between rusted buildings while Rex waited near the loading entrance, perfectly still, watching Daniel, waiting for him to catch up. Victor Hale shifted uneasily beside them. Okay, he said carefully, voice lower than before. What exactly do you think this place is? Daniel looked toward the warehouse. Weathered boards covered windows that had not seen light in years. Rust spread across metal siding. Salt air had eaten away nearly everything except silence. Maybe storage, Daniel said quietly. Temporary. Victor frowned. For what? Daniel hesitated. Depends what somebody wanted forgotten. The sentence settled hard between them. Even Victor stopped talking after that. Rex suddenly stepped closer to the old loading bay door. Nose lifted, then lowered again toward damaged concrete beneath the entrance. Slow, methodical. Daniel followed. The shepherd had done this all day. No wasted movement. No confusion. Purpose. Like scent had drawn a map nobody else could see. Daniel crouched carefully beside the doorway. The concrete here looked older than near the buried compartment. Cracked deeper. Weather damaged. Yet something stood out. Tiny scrape marks near the edge of the loading platform. Old, but deliberate. Like heavy equipment had once moved something in and out repeatedly. Daniel brushed dirt aside with his glove. Beneath debris sat a rusted metal plate barely visible against the ground. Different from the compartment outside. Smaller. Attached to something beneath the warehouse floor itself. Victor leaned closer now despite obvious discomfort. Please tell me we are not opening another mystery box. Daniel almost smiled faintly. Not planning to, but Rex disagreed. The shepherd stepped forward and pressed his nose firmly against a narrow space beneath the loading door. Then sat back immediately, watching Daniel again. Waiting. That same certainty. Daniel exhaled slowly. You really want me to look? Wind rattled somewhere high on the roof. Loose metal groaned softly overhead. For a moment the whole place felt forgotten by time itself. Yet somehow not empty. Daniel carefully knelt lower and looked beneath the warped loading door. Darkness. Dust. Old wood beams. Then something caught faint light near the back interior wall. Metal shelves maybe. Crates. Hard to tell. But one thing stood out clearly. A faded navy stencil barely visible on something rectangular sitting inside. Daniel pulled back slowly. Victor noticed his expression immediately. What? Daniel stayed quiet for several seconds. There is more in there. Victor stared. You are serious? Daniel nodded once. Looks military. Victor rubbed both hands across his face like the situation had moved far beyond normal. Why would nobody know about this? Daniel looked toward the hidden compartment behind them. Maybe somebody did. Silence followed. Wind moved harder now, carrying distant thunder over blackening water. Rex remained calm beside Daniel, tail still, eyes focused. No fear, only patience. Like he had already known the hardest part was simply getting Daniel here. Then Daniel noticed something else near the loading entrance. Wedged deep inside rust near the frame sat a tiny piece of faded yellow fabric. Torn. Old. Barely hanging on after years of weather. Something about it felt strangely familiar. Daniel reached carefully and pulled it free. Small stitched letters remained barely visible despite age. CM. Daniel stopped breathing for half a second. Caleb Mercer. Same initials. Same yellow emergency gear his teammate used to carry everywhere during coastal recovery missions. Daniel slowly closed his hand around the fabric while cold air moved harder across the harbor. Rex stepped closer and gently rested against Daniel's shoulder. Quiet. Steady. Present. Daniel looked down at the shepherd and whispered words barely loud enough to hear. You found him, buddy. And for the first time in years, something old inside Daniel no longer felt buried. Evening settled quietly over the marina, turning gray clouds darker as cold rain threatened somewhere beyond the horizon. Harbor lights flickered alive one by one while fishing crews disappeared home, leaving only the sound of distant water pressing softly against wooden docks. Near the abandoned seafood warehouse, Daniel Walker stood motionless beneath the loading entrance, fingers wrapped carefully around the faded yellow fabric stitched with two weathered letters. CM. Caleb Mercer. 22 years vanished all at once. Not completely. Memory never returned clean. It arrived in fragments. A laugh during deployment. Coffee gone cold during overnight recovery work. A man who asked too many questions because he believed things should make sense. Caleb had been stubborn that way. Honest too. The kind of person who still believed the truth mattered even when paperwork tried to bury it. Daniel swallowed slowly. No, he murmured quietly to himself. This does not make sense. Rex leaned gently against his side, calm and steady, sensing the change in him. The shepherd had done that for years. Sometimes dogs knew what people could not say out loud. Victor Hale shifted uneasily nearby, hands deep inside his coat pockets against growing cold. You really think this belonged to someone you knew? Daniel nodded once without looking up. Caleb Mercer. His voice stayed quiet. Careful. Worked recovery operations together. Victor frowned. And he left this here? Daniel looked toward the boarded warehouse. I do not know. Wind rattled old metal above them, while distant thunder rolled softly across black water. Daniel turned the faded fabric carefully in his hands. Years of salt and weather had nearly erased it, yet something remained. A folded edge. Deliberate stitching. Like someone had tied it onto gear for identification. He remembered now. Caleb always marked equipment with bright yellow tape because things got lost too easily during storm operations. Strange what memory saved. Stranger what it hid until the right moment. Rex suddenly stood taller again. Alert. Focused. Nose lifted toward the warehouse interior. Daniel noticed immediately. You smell something else? The shepherd moved toward a narrow side entrance partially hidden beneath collapsed wood and rusted piping. Then stopped. Sat down. Watching Daniel. Waiting again. Daniel exhaled quietly. Of course there is more. Victor rubbed his forehead slowly. This dog seriously gives me chills. Daniel almost smiled. He usually knows before I do. Together they moved carefully toward the side entrance where old boards leaned crooked against the wall. One section looked weaker than the rest, barely attached after years of weather damage. Daniel crouched and carefully shifted part of the wood aside. Dust drifted softly through cold air. A narrow opening appeared just large enough to look through. Darkness filled most of the warehouse interior. Old shelves, broken crates, rusted machinery abandoned long ago. Yet near the back wall something stood strangely untouched. A metal storage locker, navy gray beneath years of dust. Daniel stared silently. You see that? Victor leaned closer. Looks locked. Daniel nodded slowly. Rex let out one low sound deep in his chest. Calm. Certain. Daniel felt something settle heavily inside him again. Because this no longer felt random. Too many connections. Too much hidden. Too much waiting. Caleb, he whispered quietly. What were you doing here? Wind slipped through broken siding, while rain finally began tapping softly against the warehouse roof. Daniel carefully reached through the opening with one arm, shifting loose debris enough to widen the gap slightly. Not entering, just looking closer. Then something unexpected caught faint light near the metal locker. A waterproof case sitting on top. Small. Military style. Daniel froze. His breathing slowed. He recognized it immediately. Same model issued during coastal recovery operations years ago. Waterproof document storage. Used for mission manifests. Identification records. Emergency correspondence. The kind of thing people carried when information mattered. Victor looked confused again. You know what that is? Daniel nodded. Yeah. His voice dropped softer. I think somebody left answers. For several seconds nobody moved. Rain softened overhead, while harbor lights reflected across wet pavement outside. Rex remained seated near Daniel, calm and patient, tail still against concrete. Like the hardest part had only been getting here. Daniel reached carefully through the gap, once more, fingers barely touching the edge of the waterproof case. Then he stopped suddenly. Tucked beneath it sat something else. Yellowed paper sealed carefully inside clear plastic. A handwritten label barely visible beneath dust and age. Daniel's chest tightened painfully when he finally read the words. For Daniel Walker. Silence filled the warehouse entrance. Even Victor said nothing now. Rain fell harder beyond the loading dock, while cold wind pushed through the marina. Daniel stared at the forgotten package with disbelief written quietly across his face. 22 years. Somehow, impossibly, someone had left something behind meant only for him. And somehow, against every reasonable explanation, Rex had found it. Rain settled steadily over the marina, turning pavement dark and reflective beneath flickering harbor lights, while cold wind pushed softly between rusted buildings. Daniel Walker remained kneeling near the narrow warehouse opening, unable to take his eyes off the weathered plastic envelope tucked beneath the old waterproof case. For Daniel Walker. The words sat quietly against years of dust like they had simply been waiting for him to return. 22 years. 22 winters. 22 birthdays forgotten somewhere between grief and survival. Beside him, Rex rested calmly against his shoulder, warm and steady despite the cold. The giant German shepherd had stopped searching now. No more pacing. No more signals. Only quiet patience, like somehow the hardest part had finally ended. Victor Hale stood nearby beneath dripping rain, strangely silent for once. You are telling me, he said slowly. Somebody left something in there for you more than 20 years ago? Daniel swallowed carefully before answering. Looks that way. His voice sounded distant even to himself, like part of him had not caught up yet. Carefully, Daniel reached farther through the narrow opening. Fingers stiff from cold finally touched the edge of the plastic envelope. Slowly, carefully, he pulled it free. Dust drifted softly through the beam of fading evening light while rain tapped gently overhead. The envelope felt heavier than paper should have. Not physically, emotionally. Like memory carried weight all its own. Daniel stared at his own name written across the front in handwriting he recognized immediately. Caleb Mercer. No doubt about it. Messy lettering. Slight slant to the left. Same handwriting from mission notes years ago. Same man who used to scribble reminders on coffee cups and maps because he claimed memory failed everybody eventually. Daniel let out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding. It is him, he whispered. Victor looked uncertain now. You okay? Daniel nodded once though emotion sat thick in his throat. Yeah. Then after a pause. No. Rain softened around them while harbor lights shimmered against black water nearby. Carefully, Daniel opened the weathered seal. Inside sat several folded documents protected beneath plastic. One photograph, a letter, and something else. Official paperwork bearing faded Navy markings. Daniel hesitated before unfolding the letter. Hands shook slightly. Not from cold. Rex gently pressed closer again. Quiet reassurance. Daniel finally opened the first page. The paper had yellowed with age but remained readable. The first line stopped him completely. If you are reading this, old friend, then somehow life finally carried you back here. Daniel looked away for a moment, blinking hard against emotion he had spent years learning not to show. Wind moved softly through broken warehouse siding. Even Victor stayed quiet now. Daniel continued reading. Caleb explained everything simply. Years earlier, during coastal recovery operations, their unit discovered missing Navy compensation records tied to forgotten maritime recovery workers and veterans injured during classified support missions. Paperwork had vanished. Funds quietly delayed. Families forgotten. Caleb had tried exposing mistakes internally. Nothing changed. Eventually, he hid copies of records himself while searching for safer ways to protect them. The warehouse became temporary storage. Then life moved quickly. Health problems. Relocation. Fear that records might disappear completely. So Caleb left instructions. And one promise. If Daniel ever came back, the truth belonged to him. Daniel stared quietly at the pages while rain softened into mist around them. Forgotten compensation? Victor asked carefully after Daniel explained pieces aloud. Daniel nodded. Looks like veterans never received support they were supposed to. Victor looked genuinely unsettled now. People knew. Daniel folded the papers carefully. Somebody probably did. Silence settled again. Rex suddenly shifted, resting his head gently against Daniel's leg. Daniel smiled faintly for the first time in what felt like months. Yeah, he whispered softly, scratching behind the shepherd's ear. You knew before all of us. Then Daniel unfolded the photograph tucked between documents. His chest tightened again. Younger versions of himself and Caleb stood beside storm recovery equipment near the coast decades ago, smiling, exhausted, alive in ways memory had nearly stolen. On the back sat another handwritten note. Tell Rex thank you for me. Daniel froze. Victor leaned closer. What? Daniel almost laughed quietly through emotion. Caleb loved military dogs. He shook his head once, disbelief mixing gently with grief. Guess he figured someday one might help finish what he started. Wind moved softer now, storm beginning to ease over the harbor. Somewhere beyond the marina, clouds slowly shifted apart, letting faint evening light touch dark water. Daniel carefully packed the documents back into the protective sleeve. For the first time in years, something inside him felt strangely different. Not fixed, but lighter somehow, like purpose had quietly returned when he stopped looking for it. Rex stood beside him, calm as ever, watching with patient eyes that seemed to understand more than words ever could. Daniel rested one tired hand against the shepherd's neck and whispered softly into the cold evening air. Looks like we are not done yet, partner. 3 months later, winter arrived gently along the Oregon coast, softer than anyone expected. Morning sunlight stretched quietly across the marina, touching fishing boats with pale gold while cold air carried the familiar scent of salt water and pine drifting in from the hills beyond town. The abandoned seafood warehouse still stood at the far edge of the harbor, though now something about it felt different. Cleaner somehow. No longer forgotten. The buried Navy compartment had been carefully documented after Daniel Walker turned over Caleb Mercer's records to a veterans legal assistance group in Portland. Quiet investigations followed. Nothing dramatic. No headlines. No scandal loud enough for television. Just forgotten paperwork finally finding daylight after years spent buried beneath silence. Several retired veterans and families eventually received delayed compensation that had disappeared somewhere inside complicated systems long ago. Some money arrived. More importantly, acknowledgement arrived too. Names remembered. Service recognized. People finally heard. Daniel never expected any of it to matter much to him personally. Yet somehow it had. Strange how purpose returned when life stopped feeling permanent in its loneliness. The town changed too. Slowly at first. Quietly. Like most real things. People who once crossed the street to avoid Daniel now nodded hello near the Harbor Cafe. Dock workers sometimes offered coffee. The woman at the bakery near Harbor Street began setting aside leftover sandwiches each morning without making a big deal out of it. Small kindnesses. Quiet things. The kinds of things lonely people remembered longest. Even Victor Hale changed. Maybe more than anyone. One cold afternoon, he walked up carrying an extra cup of coffee and stood awkwardly near Daniel, without saying much for nearly a minute. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I was wrong about you." Daniel looked toward the harbor before answering. "You did not know me." Victor nodded slowly. Still. Then after a pause. "The Marina Board approved something." Daniel frowned slightly. "What kind of something?" Victor gestured toward the small caretaker cabin near the eastern docks. Modest place. 1 bedroom. Weathered porch. Harbor view if morning fog cooperated. "Needs someone nearby overnight anyway," Victor said carefully. "Not glamorous." Daniel looked surprised. "You serious?" Victor shrugged once. "Rent-free if you help watch things." Then he looked toward Rex resting calmly nearby. Dog included. Daniel stood quiet for a moment. Long enough that Victor looked uncomfortable again. Finally, Daniel nodded once. "Thank you." No dramatic speeches followed. No movie moment. Just 2 tired men standing near cold water while wind moved softly through harbor ropes overhead. Sometimes healing arrived quietly. Like that. Rex adjusted fastest to their new routine. Every morning, the giant German shepherd walked the docks beside Daniel before sunrise, ears high, tail steady, watching boats leave harbor as gulls called overhead. Local fishermen began greeting him by name. Kids visiting the marina asked permission to pet him. Nobody feared him anymore. People trusted dogs who looked like they carried wisdom, especially dogs who somehow helped uncover forgotten truth. On colder mornings, Daniel still carried Caleb's letter folded carefully inside his jacket pocket. The photograph, too. Younger versions of himself and Caleb smiling beside storm recovery gear during years when life still felt wide open. Sometimes grief softened when memory finally found peace. Sometimes not everything broken needed fixing, just understanding. One morning before sunrise, Daniel stood quietly near the water while Rex sat beside him, watching soft waves move beneath pale winter light. Steam rose gently from coffee held between cold hands. Behind them, the marina slowly woke to another ordinary day. Somewhere nearby, fishermen laughed while preparing gear. Somebody waved. Somebody else called out good morning. Simple things. Things Daniel once thought life had finished giving him. Near the edge of the dock stood a small wooden plaque recently placed beside a weathered bench overlooking the harbor. In quiet letters it read, "In honor of forgotten service, loyal friends, and truths finally found." Daniel looked at it for a long moment before smiling faintly to himself. "Caleb would have hated how sentimental that sounds," he said softly. Rex glanced up briefly. Daniel scratched behind the shepherd's ear. "You probably would not care, though." Wind moved gently across the harbor, while morning sunlight finally broke fully through gray clouds. Daniel looked out over open water, quieter inside than he had been in years. Not because life suddenly turned perfect. It had not. Some losses stayed. Some memories always ached. But loneliness no longer felt permanent. Purpose had returned in unexpected ways. Friendship, too. He rested one hand gently against Rex's shoulder and exhaled slowly into cold morning air. "Funny thing," he whispered quietly, watching sunlight touch the water. "The whole world wanted us gone." Rex leaned softly against him. Steady as always. Daniel smiled faintly. "Turns out we were standing exactly where we needed to be." And somewhere beyond the harbor, waves carried morning light across open water like the world quietly remembering that kindness sometimes returned in ways nobody could ever predict.